I was mildly excited about doing the chalkboard today just because it would have fit with this theme of doing kinship charts and old school anthropology. In the old days, 100 years ago, anthropologists got really into this kinship thing because it was assumed that, like, biological reproduction, of course, everybody does need to do it, and so that was assumed to be a human universal, and the idea was that all societies would reckon their kinship in the same way. For example, in my wife's family, in the Korean language, you call your uncles on your father's side, the kinship term is like little father or big father. And since they're in the same generation, you would use the same kinship word as father. Now, we don't do that, but some people would say that in those societies there were claims that they didn't know who their father was. But that's not true, but there was these odd ideas that people didn't know in so-called primitive societies, people didn't know who their father or mother were, and you had this primitive promiscuity. And so the idea is that you could rank people based on their kinship system. Now, certainly in some ways, or in many ways, it was a super interesting project. But it became so big in anthropology that we'd map out all these kinship systems and we'd compare them to each other, that some people said that anthropology was becoming kinshipology, because that's all we did. But there was a famous book by Radcliffe-Brown called Structure and Function in Primitive Society, over there in Brit anthropology land. And basically the idea, as you can tell, I'm simplifying it, is that if you could figure out the structure of a society, the structure of their institutions, then you would be able to explain all kinds of customs or how these things functioned. So different societies would use different terms. We talked about in matrilineal or patrilineal societies, you would think of yourself as more related to certain people and maybe less or not even related to other people. So we have only one word for cousin, which is not distinguished between father's side cousins and mother's side cousins. However, if you lived in a patrilineal society, the distinction between father's side cousins and mother's side cousins is pretty huge. And you would have different words for them, and in fact, you wouldn't necessarily think of yourself as related to the cousins on your mother's side, because that would be a different lineage if you lived in a patrilineal society. And conversely, if you lived in a matrilineal society, your patrilineal cousins would not be very important to you. Now, your chart here introduces another term, which is the matrilateral cross cousins. Let's say you were in a matrilineal society, your cross cousins would be your mother's brother's children. And in a matrilineal society, actually, the mother's brother is usually your mother's brother, so your uncle on your mother's side. In a matrilineal society, the mother's brother is a hugely important person in your life, because the mother's brother is the one who is getting the inheritance, who is often the holder of the lineage and all those things. And so in many matrilineal societies, the uncle on your mother's side may be more important to you than your father, because your father actually belongs to a different lineage. And that father is going to be looking after his matrilineal cousin. So it does tell us all kinds of funny things. And Radcliffe-Brown developed the example of what was called joking relationships. And it was just an interesting, it was looking at various societies. And there's a society which was very buttoned down and puritanical when it came to talking about sex. You know how some people in some cultures and some societies, and even in our own society, you never mention the word sex, as in sexuality, sex. So they were very, didn't like to make jokes about it, no dirty jokes, none of that stuff. There's that term, dirty. We shouldn't call it that. Sex is natural. But anyway, in this society, they didn't talk about it that much. Except what he noticed is that when a certain young man, got together or was in the presence of a certain older woman, all of a sudden it was like they were joking with each other. There was all this sex talk, pulling, pushing, laughing. But then when those two, it was only those two. And not only those two, it was this relationship in society. Let me put it to you this way. This is a kinship relationship, which also functions in our own society. It's a source of tension for many people. How do you think these people were related? The young man and older woman.
Mother-in-law.
Thank you! Mother-in-law, exactly. The point of what he was saying is this was a way to diffuse the tension in what was a tense relationship. So again, I don't know if this occurs in your lives, but sometimes there are tensions between mother-in-law relationships in certain societies. And what he was saying is this whole joking behavior was a way to diffuse that tension, and then everybody could go on with their lives. So really fascinating stuff. The other thing that's fascinating about this is I said that you would be related to certain people, but not to others. And so your textbook says that there are, in all societies, and Anthropology says, in all societies there are incest taboos. That is to say, you're not supposed to marry somebody that is too close to you, kinship-wise. But where exactly that taboo extends to is not necessarily always the same. So if you lived in a patrilineal society, your matrilateral cousins might be considered to be potential marriage partners because you really wouldn't be related to them. Now, I see you looking at me like I don't want to get married to my cousin. That is true. Don't necessarily try this at home, although the geneticists say that it's not that big a deal. You don't want to do it repeatedly, but like one or two, a few in there, it doesn't matter that much because we're all so closely related anyway. But the thing is all societies have these incest taboos, but where you draw the line is not necessarily the same in all societies. Well, I'll not talk about that too much because getting icked out. One of the most famous books about kinship is a book called The New Heir by Evans Pritchard, which talked about organizing society along lines of descent. So what Evans Pritchard was trying to figure out was how were these people, the New Heir, who had no state government, how are they organizing themselves, and how are they in fact resisting British colonialism, even though they didn't seem to have a state or a structure to do it. And what he decided is that kinship was a key way of organizing people, and it didn't necessarily have to be completely biological kinship, but simply this idea that you were in a lineage or a family, and that was the way that societies organized themselves without having a state government. And so again, this contributed to the idea that anthropologists had of the importance of kinship in organizing society outside of government, nations, those kinds of things that we are perhaps more familiar with. The thing about this is that we talked about this in the last class a little bit. In some ways, it's actually the anthropologists and perhaps the Brits who are very obsessed with this kind of lineage and family tree and tracing your ancestry back to King Arthur and stuff like that. It's not that they were unaware of kinship, but they seem to be a lot more flexible than some of the kinship charts would have indicated. And again, this brings us to something that we discussed in the last class, is that it was one thing to represent all these things abstractly as rules. And that was often the perspective of the older members of society who'd be talking to the anthropologists, and they'd be like, yeah, this person married that person because they have this relationship and etc. But in actuality, the lived experience of who you were close to and why was often different from these rules. The other thing is about the New Era and other societies that anthropologists were studying is that at the time they were in semi-active resistance to British colonialism. And so here's Evans Pritchard going in and studying the New Era, and they were pretty pissed off that the Brits had been, for example, machine gunning some of their villages and just being in general mean and colonial. Now, let me ask you this. If you are in a situation of war, who do you draw on? Who can you trust? Who can you trust? Yeah, okay, you can trust your dad. Yes, you can still trust your dad. Yeah, the point is, who are you going to be most drawing upon? Your family, the people that you're closest to. So it may not be that the New Era were that concerned about family, but in a situation of conflict or war, or when the internet is down, there's only a few people that you can trust. In this chapter, we also discuss the idea of marriage. So we get kinship from descent, obviously, we're descended from, but we also get kinship in terms of who we get married to. Now, Gus tells us, and anthropologists tell us, marriage, traditionally, has been very important for political alliances, inheritance, economics. What's missing here from marriage? Love. Love! Love! Yeah, we're not supposed to be thinking about that stuff. Oh, wait. Yeah. What about love? Right? Because in many different societies, it's not that people didn't have a choice about whom they would marry, but people would fix things up. They'd arrange the marriages. And so, what about love? Now, something resembling love, the sentiment or emotion of love, is something that people talk about all over the world. And it's probably in every society, a human universal. And even people who have arranged marriages talk about love. They might talk about it a little differently, though. They might talk about it as, well, we weren't in love at first, but over time we grew to be more in love and we grew to appreciate each other. Or they may use that as part of being arranged marriage. So there's love, that's always around. But the idea that you could base your marriage on romantic love in most societies would be seen as crazy. Let me put it to you this way. Falling in love is oftentimes more the way you get out of a relationship than the way you get into one. Haven't you ever had your heart broken by somebody you were in a relationship with and all of a sudden they fall in love with somebody else? Has that ever happened? Oh, yeah. And that's why traditional societies would be like, no, you can't just base it on love. People fall in and out of love all the time. They're always dancing around. They're being all fickle, having 3 or 4 relationships because of love. We can't just let love decide. It's too fragile. Y'all don't believe me. That said, around the world, people have much more, not just in our society. And in our society, this is only in the last couple hundred years that we've talked about love as the basis for marriage. It comes around at the same time as those Jane Austen novels, Pride and Prejudice stuff. But around the world, people have talked more and more about love. The interesting thing is a lot of societies are starting to question that idea, and they're going back to something more of a mix of arranged or not. When we say arranged marriages, there's a range of things that happen, and those can be more like an enhanced dating service, like a matchmaker service. It's not necessarily that you're matched with somebody from the age of 2. It's like a way of matching people up. So some people have gotten disillusioned with the idea of love as a basis for marriage and gone back to more traditional forms. All right. Now this next part is going to be tough on me. All right. So in all societies, there are rules about who we can marry, who we should or could or should be attracted to, and who we shouldn't be. And these in anthropology are called exogamy and endogamy. So there's a certain amount of exogamy, which is, oh wait, anyway, we're getting there. There's a certain amount of exogamy, which means you have to marry somebody outside of your group. So you can't marry too close. You can't marry your brother or your sister. You have to be somebody that's further away, that's not so related to you. So those are rules of exogamy. But there's also rules of endogamy. Most people, for example, would not marry outside, or traditionally, people would hesitate to marry outside of their religion, sometimes outside of their ethnicity. Now in this country, we are totally free. You can fall in love with whomever you want. You're just searching for your soulmate. If you've only had 0 falling in loves, don't worry, that person is out there. And when you find that person, you guys are just going to connect like this. You'll fall in love one time and you'll be married and life will be beautiful. And we don't know who that is because it's your destiny and your soulmate. But the funny thing is that in this country, almost always that soulmate will be of your same social class. They will be at about the same social class level. Working class people usually marry other working class people. Rich people all usually marry other rich people. Which is weird because you should be able to marry whoever you want. So, how do you keep this belief in love while at the same time you have statistically class endogamy, social class endogamy, which usually also leads to race endogamy? How do you do that? Why is it that we marry people who are basically from our same social class in this country? If we're so free, jaunting around, using dating apps. A lot of this has to do with your zip code in this country. We talked about how our wealth levels are pretty much determinative of the house we'll be able to buy and where we will be able to be raised, the schools we will be able to go to. And so this is one of the reasons why our schools are as segregated as they were back in the 1950s, back before they were legally desegregated. They have been resegregated. And the segregation is not legal. It's simply that the people who have more wealth go into different places, get into their gated communities, and then you meet each other. And yes, it's going to be the people you meet who are close to you. But how is it, for example, I've told you about my wife being of Korean heritage. She was born in New York City, raised there, and I was born in the West, raised in Montana. How is it that we would ever meet each other?
You tell me.
Somebody already said it. I don't have to tell you.
Modern technology.
You said college.
College is one of the great places where we put people together basically of the same social class, even if they are not related. So you get college, you get people together, you get all those hormones firing off, and then you're meeting people of the same social class. Because again, things like test scores and educational attainment are pretty well mapped or correlated onto wealth. And so we can have this complete freedom. We can say, do whatever you want. That's what I tell my kids. I tell them, do whatever I want. But for the most part, they're probably going to end up with somebody in the same social class. So even though my wife and I are of distinct ethnicities and raised in totally different places, when we got together in college, you're on the same social class trajectory. In fact, Guess says, I can't find this page number right now because of the internet, that often wealthy parents want to send their kids to elite private schools so that they make sure that they're in the same group. I will say though that Hartwick is a little bit weird that way. We actually have some cross-class people in relationships. We're not quite as class homogeneous as other colleges. I'm not sure why that is, but we are. We often get people from the wealthier suburbs and the rural areas. So you all have more of a chance. You might be more diverse. Oh, let's see. Marriage. Usually this comes up a lot more in other introductory textbooks. Guest spends less time on it, and so I will too. The idea of monogamy, married to one person, versus the idea of polygamy, or being able to be married to more than one person. Polygamy actually has two forms. When we say the word polygamy, we're usually referring to what is called polygyny or polygyny, which is one man being married to more than one wife. This is actually a permitted, legally permitted form in the majority of the world's societies. But in most of those societies, it is not a form that people do because it's actually something that is very expensive to do. For example, in Islamic societies, it is often permitted to have a polygynous relationship. However, you have to provide separate houses for each of your wives. So if you've ever tried to have one house and then try to have 2 or 3 houses, you know that you're going to have to be pretty wealthy to be able to pull that off. So it is not a majority of marriages in the world societies. I was joking with you that you're going to have 5 or 6 falling in loves before the age of 30, but in our own society we have what is called, or many people have what is called serial monogamy, which means you're married to one person for a while and then you're married to another person. So some people have speculated, is that different or better than a form of polygamy? The other form of polygamy is polyandry, which as a form of marriage is very rare. This is where a woman would be married to more than one man. And it's one of the rarer forms of marriage in the world. There's a famous anthropological article called When Brothers Share a Wife, which is about one of the places where it was permitted in highland Tibet. And basically what the anthropologist argues is that this form of marriage occurs when resources are limited, especially things like land. And so it keeps resources in the same family. It keeps them from being divided up, but even the people there are not necessarily into it. Polygyny, on the other hand, is a form that is allowed where resources might be more abundant and you need more labor to do things. If you remember back to reading Shakespeare and the Bush, that was one of the things they talked about, is that a king should have many wives or several wives because of all the things that need to be done or the labor that has to be done in that area. Later on in this chapter, Guess asks a very important question. Are biology and descent and marriage the only basis for kinship? This is a dumb question. What's the answer?
No.
No, thank you. My page number's wrong there too. Sorry, guys. No. Why not? What else could you base it on? Or what else did you see out there in the world? So, one of the things that anthropologists have found in most societies, and even in our own society, is that kinship, even if you consider yourself biologically related to somebody, is something that you have to actively do or actively make. And one of the ways we do that is through sharing food. And in some societies, that is very explicit. In Liv's Malaysian society, they're like the people who share food together are going to look and act the same and be related. And in some ways, this is biologically true. If you're always eating the same stuff as you grow up together, that's going to affect your biological development. Some people consider that breastfeeding or breast milk is also this substance which can make people related to each other. Do I want to talk about this today? No. So, in some ways, people have family that they are related to. And in other cases, there are different ideas about sharing food or sharing substances, which people say makes you related. There's a book that Guest talks about called Families We Choose. That in fact, many people, and this is not just today, but in other societies and in other times, place a lot of importance on the relationships that they have, not necessarily part of what we might consider a traditional family. Now, some people don't like that. They say that changes are breaking down the traditional family, and now It's going to lead to social disorder. Cats sleeping with dogs. Everything's going to go bad. What is this traditional family they're referring to? The nuclear family. The nuclear family. So the idea is we're all supposed to be part of this nuclear family. Has that been true? Is it as true as they think it is? Yeah. The nuclear family, in some ways, is part of cites this book by Stephanie Kuntz. It's a great book. It's called The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap. And what she talks about here is we have this idea that there used to be these nuclear families, and we were all in nuclear families. And in fact, if you look statistically, even at those eras of the 1950s and black and white Leave It to Beaver TV shows, it isn't representative of how most Americans were. So in fact, if we think about the true traditional family, it is probably something that is more like an extended family, and is probably a lot more flexible than those kinds of ideas that we have. And so these families that we choose are actually perhaps in many ways more in line with what we would consider traditional than we would have known before. Now, Guest also here talks about the idea of kinship and the nation state. Now, if you remember back to Evans Pritchard and his ideas about how people were organized outside the nation state, the idea was that people were organized according to kinship and descent lines. We also had the idea that as we developed these countries or nations, that kinship would disappear as a way of organizing, or fade out as a way of organizing our society. In some ways, the kinship metaphors and the ideas about who we're related to don't necessarily fade out as much as they are extended out to what we've talked about as imagined communities. So that I imagine myself as related enough to somebody from California that we can jump in a boat together and go across the world and go to war for our country, is in some ways this idea that I have kinship with people who are in my nation state. Now, one of the interesting things about kinship is that actually there's ideas about who belongs to whom, and who is considered to be part of the inheritance, especially with things that we call new reproductive technologies. So artificial insemination, being able to have donor mothers. Well, what happens in, say, Israeli society with these kinds of things? Would it still count with artificial insemination, right? So if your Jewishness is passed down in a certain way and you're using new reproductive technologies, does that mean you are still going to be considered part of this group? And so this has raised a number of questions for people, like what form of kinship is going on here? Yeah, some of these things are, the more cutting edge reproductive technologies are new, but people have always been trying to mess around with their fertility.
And purification things and stuff like that.
Yeah, and herbs and doctors, and yeah, this is something that people have always been trying to mess around with their fertility to either increase or decrease it as needed. But it doesn't develop interesting points here. So, wrapping back to the idea of kinshipology, or what people thought was going on. So what people thought in the old days they were going to find is basically what we might call heteronormativity, that all people would have to get together as in heterosexual relationships in order to reproduce the next generation. They believe that if people didn't understand that meant that they were primitive or didn't know what was going on, and that people were evolving in a certain way so that people would become more modern and know what that was. And that you could rank societies in this hierarchy based on their reckoning of kinship. What the anthropologists found, was this enormous cultural variability in how people reckoned kin, how people made their relationships, what people did, and that people could change in ways which were not necessarily directional or hierarchical. And so the idea that certain changes would lead to social disorder, no, most people can take an amount of change and just becomes different, not good or bad. And that actually, if you think about who we reckon as our kin and our family, that there's lots of different ways to do that. And there's always going to be tensions in any society between different groups of people, but there's lots of things that you can do to work on that. Now, I would say that understanding kinship in this way is a great thing to do if you are fighting ethnocentrism and determinism. You don't like the purple face?
It's like unsettling. Its mouth is too far away.
No.
I spent a lot of time on that purple face.
Yeah.
I had to draw it all out, didn't even have the
It's
internet.
nice.
I like the
You, I
purple
don't like
face.
I think it's very friendly.
Yeah.
Thank
What a
you.
good friend. I want that guy to be my family.
That's right.
No.
The purple face will help you fight these ideas that you can't be part of that family or that people in other societies don't have good ideas about family. Do I have another purple face? No.
Oh.
I have just an X'd out line. What is not so great is if you're then using that deterministic ideas to say, oh, in this society they can only marry their patrilateral cross cousins or something like that. Then it's not the greatest thing. So, like in other instances, what we see here is that cultural ideas are important to help us understand that human life comes in different possibilities, but we don't want to think that we are locked into a certain possibility because of our so-called culture.